Well, think about how big the S&P
Yeah.
500 is. Imagine if you
Right.
said, I can do the S&P 500 plus 20 bips with all the capacity, and you raise $1 trillion. Like, even if you're
Yeah.
charging 2 bips for it, you're making bank. What Research Affiliates was proposing, and I think it's in concept a very interesting idea, is most pure indexes are market capitalization weighted. So they choose securities. Like if you want the top 1,000 securities, they look at the entire reference universe. They find the top 1,000 securities by their free float adjusted market cap, and then they weight them in proportion to that free float adjusted market cap. The
Wait,
benefit of that.
I don't want to stop you right there. I don't want to interrupt you, but I have to. You just said float adjusted market cap, but you started with market cap weighted, but it's actually float weighted. And I think people
Yeah,
miss that a lot. So I
it
want to
is
just
float.
point that
It's
out.
most of the time it is float weighted. I'm just going to say market cap weighted, but
Right.
most of
But
the time
that
it's
difference is that it is quite a bit of difference.
yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
it
but
can be
most
an
people,
absolute yeah. But the idea there basically being for the most part you want depth and liquidity, and you're scaling according to size, and under certain assumptions that is what the efficient market is. That is how the appropriate prices for securities, and you want to own them in that proportion to own the market portfolio that aligns with the efficient market hypothesis. The problem that they propose is sort of twofold. One, if you don't believe the market's efficient, that construction is very sensitive to noise, right? Particularly in the valuation component and sentiment that shows up in price changes. If you get price changes up and down that have nothing to do with the underlying fundamental changes of the business, you can get index additions and deletions that are just noise trades. You can also find for certain indices, something like the S&P 500, that you end up with sort of price influencing committee decisions, and that you can end up basically selling securities after they're massively depressed and buying securities after a massive run up. So the proposal they make is, look, market cap weighted ends up being a buy high, sell low when you talk about additions and deletions. And the way additions and deletions work is that they're well telegraphed, which allows the index managers to do a market on close order to make sure that they perfectly time their purchase and sale with when the index is reconstituting, so that they can keep their tracking error as low as possible. It makes it look like there's zero cost to the addition or deletion because they will track the index. The problem is, by being well telegraphed, that flow is front run. And so you actually end up with what the authors argue is about 20 bips of annual cost from index additions and deletions. So if you could come up with a methodology that avoided that unnecessary additions and deletions from these, sort of sentiment noise and valuation change, one and the same, arguably, wouldn't that be a better methodology? And what they propose is this idea of economic footprint. Buy companies choose the companies based upon their fundamentals of the company, which are going to be more stable over time. And then once you've selected those companies, you can weight them in proportion to their market cap. And the idea basically being, by focusing on company fundamentals, you avoid pure bubble stocks. You're going to end up with something that looks probably more like a value tilt, slight value tilt, but it should at least be proportional to market cap. So you get deep liquidity and high capacity. And what they find is that index has 20% less turnover than the S&P and the Russell 1000. They find that the tracking error of that index to the S&P 500 is actually about on par with the tracking error between the Russell 1000 and the S&P 500. So it's not a huge amount of tracking error. But weirdly enough, and this is where it gets weird, when they run a Carhart-Fama French 4-factor model regression to try to explain the source of returns, they get this big alpha component. And it shows up with a very small loading on value, very small loading on size. They just end up with this really good looking alpha. And I think the suggestion within the paper is this wonderful alpha comes from reducing the turnover to avoid all of this unnecessary front running costs that can happen. And this is just a better construction that's more liquid, and we get a little bit of value tilt. That is the proposal. I hope I haven't butchered it. I apologize if anyone from Research Affiliates is listening that thinks I've misspoken about the research. That's not my intention. Regardless, as a quant, I kind of looked at the paper and scratched my head and said, well, that sort of smells like bullshit to me, because there's no way those index additions and deletions could add up to being as much alpha as they claim it is. And what they're claiming to do is add a value tilt, and yet there was almost no value tilt that showed up, which is a concern. And then they just have this big alpha. And look, I know everyone's looking for alpha. I think we need to reframe ourselves. Alpha is just unexplained returns. Like that's, to me, is not always a good thing. You want to know where it's coming from, and they don't really propose where it's coming from.
Man, you just front ran me on all those. Like, I was just like that. That was my questions there. Like, so you said there was about 20 bips from the iteration, like from additions, deletions, getting front run. It was 20 bips annually or 20 bips quarterly, or
annually, I believe.
So that's what I was saying. Like, how did you turn 20 bips into an alpha? But also, like, with the caveats around alpha. But
so
then,
I think the alpha was like 30 to 40 bips. So again, like
okay.
if it's 20 bips for annual turnover, and you're cutting the turnover by 20%, that should be you shaving 4 bips off, not 4. Like, you don't get 40 out of that.
Well, also, like, do we spend our lives like chasing 30 bips alpha over decades? But also, like, that's why I was like, wait, you're telling me about the front running, the additions, deletions, and how the index is constructed, and then you took a hard right turn to talk about fundamentals and value, and I was like, what does that have to do with those rebalances?
Well, because I mean, the whole idea, right, is if you are, so not only are you avoiding the rebalances, but the rebalances that you're avoiding are the buy high, sell low ones, right? Tesla came into the S&P 500 way after its run up, right? If you did things based on the economic footprint, you would have bought Tesla way beforehand. The stuff that got I think it was a REIT or something like that got sold in exchange for Tesla was massively depressed. Well, why did you sell it after the price went down? You should have retained it based on its economic footprint. It was a value stock. So their argument is twofold. One, we cut down on the turnover. It's a more stable measure. Two, the stuff where we do have turnover is not going to have this buy high, sell low problem.
Right. But to me, like, that's what I'm saying. You took a hard right turn and you started talking about, like, basically like equal weight index or evaluated equal weight index. And I was like, what did that have to do necessarily with those rebalances? I can see how you could stretch and say potentially that avoids that risk, but at 20 bips a year, who really cares? And then the other part of it is, like you said, is like, wait, you said you tilted to more value equal weight fundamentals, but then, like, it didn't show up when you went back and did a factor regression.
I mean,
so
it
like,
shows up it's like a very small tilt, right? And now I think they might say, well, that's the tilt is the tilt. Like, we are, yes, we're screening on economic footprint, and it creates a very small tilt towards value. Here's where my quant spidey senses got tingling. They did a plot of the alpha, and you talk about all the quants are just data mining crisp. When you're a quant for long enough, you know what certain return streams look like. Mm-hmm. Like, I know what the value factor looks like. I know what growth looks like. I know what their alpha profiles look like over time. And I'm looking at this alpha stream and I'm like, this looks, for the first, there's like a 20-year back test of this concept. The first half looks identical to value, and the second half looks identical to growth. And I'm scratching my head. I'm like, well, let's say somehow in their methodology, this strategy somehow went from value to growth. It was a heavy value strategy at the beginning. Some way it became a growth strategy. Well, that would mean that in the first half of the series, you had a positive loading on value. In the second half of the series, you had a negative loading on value, averaging out to having zero factor, from a full period regression standpoint, zero loading on value. So that would explain that. And we know value outperformed in the first half. We know growth outperformed in the second half. If they managed to have that style drift, the alpha would emerge and be unexplained because it's style drift. It's timing alpha.
Do you remember the time series, like roughly, like when did it shift?
Right around 2009.
Yeah. So I wonder too, like, are you in the camp that like talks about basically that most S&P 500 index are essentially trend following a Momo? Like you're saying, buy higher. Like, I mean, I'll let you handle that before I keep going.
Yeah, that's a really frustrating one for me because like I get what people are saying. If you buy the market, the next day you own more of what went up and you own less of what went down, and that
No.
isn't that momentum. The problem is it's also the market. Like that
Yes.
the market is a factor. So the
Yes.
whole point is momentum is what's residual to what's explained by the market. Like, so it's sort of frustrating. I'm like, yes, I understand that mechanically that sounds like momentum, but from a return regression explanation standpoint, that's not momentum. That's just the efficient market. That's the beta. That's what beta is. So it's a
You
complicated
led
one.
me perfectly there. No, because that's why I wondered the same thing. It's like after cataclysmic shifts like 2008, or we could have potentially had March 2020 that we didn't quite see, is that index, it has to go through a violent phase shift, but then can switch back from Momo back to value, right? Because it's going to be like whatever the constituent of the market is. And
Right.
so they, like you said, if it was tracking that, and like you said, it turned in 2009, I think that's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
Like that's what the market was like, and that's you could reduce the market to those factors or regress the market to those factors, depending on when we have phase shifts. So even if we've been in a more Momo style S&P index, market float cap weighted, like it's going to take a cataclysmic shift, and then it'll be pretty value weighted, moving forward after that for a while.
Yeah.
Is that
So,
fair?
maybe, but that wasn't really what happened here.
Yeah.
So, as far as I could tell, right, this whole idea of an economic footprint, they argue breaks the link to price. Like you're buying a company. What the paper read like was like, we're going to look at the sales. We're going to look at, total dividends paid. We're going to look at um, the book value. What they really do is they look at the book value relative to the aggregate market book value. They look at their revenue relative to the aggregate market revenue. And what's weird about scaling it relative to the aggregate market economic footprint, when you do that, is it actually reintroduces market cap weighting. I'm not going to discuss the math. I need spreadsheets and digits and all that sort of stuff to derive it for you. But long story short, economic footprint, if you do it the way they did it, is actually a multi-factor screen. It screens things based on their market cap, and it screens things based on a value tilt. So what I did is I said, okay, let me try to replicate this. Do I think I replicated it precisely? Like, are my numbers equal to theirs? Absolutely not. But it doesn't affect the logic of what I did. And what I found was that by definition, they will always sell larger cap glamour stocks to buy smaller cap value stocks. Like, definitively, there's no argument that is how the process works. So I said, okay, there is absolutely a size value tilt happening in this process. Like, how does it not show up?
Right.
I said something very subtle at the beginning when I was talking about their process. I said they screen on economic footprint, and then the stuff that's left over, they market cap weight. So
yeah. So okay, sorry. Let me jump in real quick. We always are changing nomenclature and euphemism. So is market footprint just another way of saying size?
economic
Economic footprint, sorry, is another way of saying size, right?
Well, size in theory, they're trying to measure size of the company. Right. So instead of size of the security, right, which would be market cap, they're trying to measure the size of the underlying company. So it's like this, book value, revenue, cash flow, and total dividend distributed. And they do some adjustments in there, but those are the four basic metrics they use to try to figure out the economic footprint of the company relative to the aggregate market economic footprint. And then, so a company with a bigger book value relative to the aggregate book value of the market is going to be a bigger, economic footprint. So what happens, though, here's what's weird. Let's say we look at the S&P 500 and we screen out the stuff that has a lower economic footprint to buy the stuff that has a higher economic footprint. I told you that definitionally has a value size tilt. The stuff you buy is always smaller from a market cap perspective than the stuff you sold. Why is that important? Well, if the S&P 500 or the largest 500 companies right now have an aggregate market cap of like 44 trillion. The stuff you screen out today would be like 4 trillion. So you have about 40 left over that you kept in. 4 trillion gets screened out. The stuff you buy is like 1 trillion. Which means when you reweight that 40 trillion, adding in that new 1 trillion, the stuff you kept actually gets bigger. So Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, which don't get screened out, all increase in size. And if you plot their weight over the last decade, you actually ended up overweight mega cap tech names because of this second renormalization step. So yes, there was a value size screen, but that second renormalization step actually made it so that those mega cap tech names got bigger. Why didn't this happen in 1999? Well, it has to do with how many names are getting screened out, and the stuff that remains, how value oriented was it? In 1999, there was so much dog shit that had zero economic footprint but was a big market cap. There was like 40 or 50% of the S&P 500 would have been filtered out, and the stuff that remained had a strong value tilt. Today, if you do the same thing, only about 20% of the names would get filtered out, and of the stuff that remains, most of it has a growth tilt. So you're taking the growth stuff and making it bigger. And so this renormalization step that they introduced, and I don't think this was an intended effect, ends up over time, at least in my opinion, I could be completely wrong here. I don't think I am, but I could be, creates this style drift that the index started as value and became growth. And it's hard to say what it will be in the future. And I don't think that was an intended impact. And I think all the alpha is attributed to this style drift timing that worked out in their favor.
So it's interesting how it comes back to a style drift timing with mega cap tech. Like, I'm sure you've looked into it, like Vincent Delouard and others have brought up how like ESG basically filters down into mega cap tech because they have the lowest amount of employees like per revenue. And that's how it just filters to the top ESG.
All mega cap tech.
Yeah. The outperformance of ESG is just built off of mega cap tech, which is always ironic. There's a couple of things you also made me think about. One is the amount of brain drain in the quant community to try to beat the index by 20, 40 bips and for have something that may work, may not work is just insane to me. Like, what is, I mean, but that you see that all the time. It's like, this beats the index by 50 bips. You're like, okay. But then you're also like benchmarking off the index, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, but the economic incentive is massive. Like, well, think about how big the S&P 500 is. Imagine if you said, I can do the S&P 500 plus 20 bips with all the capacity, and you raise $1 trillion. Like, even if you're charging 2 bips for it, you're making bank.
Speaking of monetizing this podcast, that's our monetization heuristic. Like, you just have to subscribe to this podcast. We're out here, Corey's driving through the night trying to make it to the show. We need to afford some, paint for his walls because they're hideous. These are the things we're working on to improve the show. But all we ask from you, our pirate pinky promise, is for you to subscribe to the show.